Hello there, welcome to a special edition of Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Digidello.
This week, history is made. Donald Trump becomes the first former American president to be convicted of a crime. Several of them, in fact. We'll talk to Judge Shira Shendlin and former Trump advisor, Sam Nunberg.
And speaking of making history, friend of the show Nick Bryant has a new book out. It's a sweeping reappraisal of American history and identity. He's going to be with us later on. But first...
Defendant Donald J. Trump guilty as charged. The news quickly relayed from reporters in the courtroom to the correspondents outside.
There are guilty verdicts from our producer inside. We're hearing guilty on 1 through 5. 1 through 12, we have now 13, 14 guilty. 15 guilty. You may hear there are a split of folks here who have been protesting on both sides of this case. Some cheer, some boos, as we are now getting the information from the jury. We're up to 18 counts, 19 guilty.
And so it went to all 34 counts. No reasonable doubts. Former President Trump's response was predictable, maintaining his innocence. In fact, his very innocence.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent, and I think it's just a disgrace.
The Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg thanked the jurors and praised them for their independence.
Everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election.
So, the historic and extraordinary verdict is in. It is now down to the judge, Juan Merchan, to decide what the sentence will be. He has set a July 11th date for a sentencing hearing when he will announce whether he is sending former President Trump to prison or possibly suspending a prison sentence or indeed imposing a non-custodial sentence.
Judge Merchan's already been making a lot of decisions, and I'd like to tell you about them. This is extremely confusing now, so I just want to talk you through exactly how the judge's instructions explained to the jury what they had to decide, because that determined what the jury decided. Merchan said that a person is guilty of falsifying business records if they cause a false entry in the business records of an enterprise. Okay, that's clear. But it must include an intent to commit another crime. But what other crime? There have been some suggestions from Republicans that the prosecution didn't say what that other crime was until the very last second, but they actually did. Right from day one of the trial. They said it was a violation of New York election law section 17152, which will mean nothing to anyone. So what does that law say? It says that it's a crime for people to conspire to promote or prevent the election of any person by unlawful means. Now that raises the obvious question. What does unlawful means refer to? That is where the uncertainty was. Because the judge said, although you must conclude unanimously that the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election, you need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were. And then the judge gave the jury 3 options they could choose between. Violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, otherwise known as FECA, the falsification of other business records, or violation of tax laws. Okay, so the jury, each juror could pick one of them if they wanted to. They did not have to agree which of those 3 unlawful means they picked. What do those 3 charges actually mean though? The Federal Election Campaign Act violations involve willfully making a contribution to any candidate over a certain limit. That was what Judge Marchand said. And that's a very straightforward instruction because election law is usually incredibly complicated. But in this case, Michael Cohen clearly paid a lot more than $2,500 to Stormy Daniels, so that seems quite straightforward. As for falsifying business records, he said that involves making or causing a false entry in the business records of an enterprise. Now, Michael Cohen made a fake company up, so he did a lot of that. The question is, did he do that to promote or prevent the election of a candidate? That was the question the jury had to decide. Finally, tax fraud. Well, it's unlawful to knowingly supply or submit materially false or fraudulent information in connection with any tax return. So you can't lie on your taxes. Now, Michael Cohen did lie on his taxes a lot because he said he was being paid legal expenses when he wasn't. And this is weird because it meant he was actually paying more taxes because he was lying. But what Judge Marchand said is that conduct is unlawful even if it does not result in the underpayment of taxes. So that's potentially also an easy, unlawful means for the jury to pick. Point is, Judge Marchand made it really simple. This is actually an incredibly complicated legal theory, but he really simplified it, which I think made it much more likely that the jury would find him guilty. Yes. The question is, though, is the appeals court going to say he was right to simplify it that much? Because he did simplify it a lot.
Yes, he certainly did. I think there's one of those occasions where simply lawyering up isn't going to cut it. I think we need a judge to help us at this point. None better than Shira Shendlin. She's a former US District Court judge, and she is with us from New York, New York. Judge, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.
Was this the verdict you expected today?
No, I didn't expect a verdict today. It may have been the verdict I eventually expected, but not today. I thought at the earliest it would be Friday because typically the courthouse clears out on Friday. All the jurors want to go home. If they were having trouble, it would roll over into next week. But I sure didn't expect it on the second day of deliberations for a total number of hours of maybe 9.
Were you happy with the conducting of the trial overall?
I mean, I think Judge Marchand did a very good job of controlling the courtroom and controlling the lawyers and moving things along and making sure it was as organized as it could be for the jury. So he did everything right. When you say, are you happy? There are some things that maybe could have been done differently, but basically I think he did a very good job. His role was done well.
So the judge did a good job. What about the prosecution and the defense? Did they also do their jobs?
Well, there you have it. The prosecution did a very good job. Excellent job. Their summation was very good. Their order of witnesses was smart. I don't think that the defense did as well. Certain members of the defense did better. I thought Susan Nichols' cross-examination of Stormy Daniels was good. I thought Emil Bowe's cross-examination was good, but actually the lead lawyer did not give the most organized and most effective summation, and that may be why there was such a quick verdict. Maybe having listened to those summations, particularly the state, for 5 hours, they knew what they were going to do.
There's been some discussion about the judge offering the jury 3 different crimes that Trump could potentially have also committed while committing election fraud. Was that reasonable?
Yes, it was reasonable for him to give them a list of possible other crimes that Trump and his conspirators really intended to commit or to conceal. But what's interesting is, according to the charge, the jury did not have to be unanimous on which of the 3 they intended to commit. All they had to be unanimous on was that they intended to commit another crime. So we'll never know whether 4, 5, 1 thought different things.
Judge, I know you can't know this, but I'll ask you to speculate in any event. The disorganised defence from Todd Blanche, did that feel to you like a powerful defendant passing lots of post-it notes with suggestions, say this, say this, say this, rather than what a defence lawyer might like to be able to frame as a defence?
No, they should have been well prepared in advance. They had a 6-day break And he had a good team with the other two lawyers, Susan Nichols again and Emil Bove. They should have been working round the clock to be very coherent and very organized. And their client was with them those 6 days, or he could have been, and he didn't have to pass notes. I mean, they knew, they anticipated everything the government would say, the people would say. So there was no excuse, in my opinion, to be less than perfectly organized.
Was it fair, in your view, Judge, for the prosecution's full logic of their case to not be revealed to the jury until closing remarks?
I disagree that it wasn't revealed to the jury until closing remarks. I think the evidence came in all along. They knew all the documents. They knew all the witness testimony. The only thing you're referring to is what was the judge going to charge? And that wasn't known at that point. But everybody seemed to know, except the jury, that there was going to be a violation of the New York State election law as the other crime, but that law said you have to do it by unlawful means, which brings in more crimes. So I think that the legal world knew it. The defense counsel knew it. The prosecutors knew it. The people who didn't know it were the jury.
Judge, we have heard two quite diametrically opposed reactions, generally speaking. One is, this is a victory for the judicial system. Nobody, not even a former and possibly future president, is above the law. Others saying, what an appalling politicised process where a partisan Democrat in a Democrat city brings charges against a political opponent to try and stop them winning an election. Which side of that argument do you find yourself sympathetic towards?
Oh, I'm definitely in the former camp. This was a victory for the judicial system. He had all his rights protected. This judge went out of his way to make sure it was a fair trial, and I think he got a fair trial. That said, he was up against certain difficult odds. The fact that the case was venued in New York City, New York County, no less, New York County of New York City, which is an overwhelmingly Democratic district, as he's fond of saying, he only carried 6 or 7% of the vote. So that can't be helped. That's where his office was. That's where his residence was. That's where he lived. So it was fair to venue it in New York. But I take his point that most New Yorkers are not fans of Donald Trump. Still in all, I'm sure that the judge charged them and they took the charge seriously, that they went out of their way to put that aside, any dislike of him, listen to the evidence hard, and reach a verdict based on the evidence. And I think they did.
Could Judge Merchan take into account how Trump conducts himself over the next 6 weeks when it comes to sentencing, or is that completely irrelevant?
I hope it's completely irrelevant because the judge should be sophisticated enough to know that Trump is running for public office and he has a base and he has to play to the base and he has to campaign and he has to say, oh, that corrupt judge, which he's been saying the whole trial, and the corrupt system and all that. He has to do that. So I would hope he wouldn't hold it against him. Now, again, he can hold against him the contempt citations that he's already given. So when it comes time to sentence him, he can consider that he held him in contempt on 10 different occasions. So that's something he will consider.
What else goes into that consideration, Judge? And how likely do you think it is that, all things considered, we could see a prison sentence in July?
Yeah, that's the question everyone's asking. So you can consider a person's age. He's 77. You can consider that he's a first offender and it's a white-collar crime. And typically, a white-collar criminal on a first offense with no criminal record doesn't get jail time, typically. But then on the other hand, you could say, but he corrupted an entire election. He essentially stole an election by suppressing information that the voters might have cared about. So that makes this a far more serious crime than just a ledger entry that isn't accurate in some little business that nobody knows about or cares about. This becomes a really big national issue that probably affected the outcome of the election. So I think he's going to take that into account. Now, do I think he should impose a jail sentence? Actually, I don't. I don't think it's helpful to bringing the country together. I don't think it's good for the country. I think it will further polarize the people here. Half the people will think it's a political move. The other half will think it was justified. But I think it only tears people apart. If you remember, Nixon was pardoned immediately by Ford, and that's the better way to do it. So I think the judge should, chastise him and give him probation or community service or house arrest or something for a little while. But I think sending him into a state prison is unduly harsh, and I'm not sure that others would be treated the same way. So he shouldn't be treated better, but he shouldn't be treated worse than other white-collar defendants who commit falsification of business records.
Well, Judge, we're very grateful indeed to have your expertise once again. You are formally excused. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right.
Okay, so much for the legalities of all this. Let's talk a little bit about the politics, Chaz. And I don't know about you, but when I heard the news about this, it felt like one of those moments that we've had at least half a dozen times in the Trump era since 2015 of surely this is the end of Donald Trump, whether it was the John McCain, he's not a hero comment, the Mexicans a rapist comments, the Access Hollywood tape, the day that came out, it seemed like this is the end of Donald Trump's presidential hopes. In the sweep of history, you would think a criminal conviction, that's it. The founders never imagined a criminal would even be considered for the presidency, so they didn't preclude that in the Constitution. You have to be 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, last 14 years in the United States, but we don't have to put in there that you can't be a criminal. It goes without saying. Well, apparently not. How did you feel when you heard the news?
Look, it wasn't a huge surprise because I was kind of expecting the verdict overall, but I guess the question for me was, where does it go from here? Because this is huge, but it can get huger still.
How so?
The sentencing hasn't been handed down yet.
Sure.
And I don't think anyone's expecting Judge Machan to hand down a prison sentence. Certainly, this offence doesn't usually attract a prison sentence.
No.
But
defendants don't usually breach gag orders a dozen times, daring the judge to send them to prison.
Well, and also, even home detention would be massive.
And a fine, a monetary penalty is going to mean nothing. You don't punish a billionaire by charging them $50,000, which is what a lot of these kind of bookkeeping misdemeanor cases cost.
I also think it could get even more massive if you think about, let's just say it's a squeaker, the election, and Biden just gets over the line, and then the appeal happens and Trump wins the appeal.
Right.
And you have a whole bunch of Republicans saying, what?
Right.
You stole the election with this phony charge.
I say it was election interference, although it was election influence. It is certainly election influence. There's no doubt that this will have an influence on the thinking of some voters. We were talking the other day on Planet America about the poll that found that more than half of respondents said, this case doesn't matter to me, it won't affect my vote. Then we had 25% saying a criminal conviction would make me less likely to vote for Trump. Then there was that bizarre 23% said a criminal conviction would make me more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Presumably they were already Trump voters or Trump supporters who may have stayed at home. They're now more motivated to come out and vote. So I guess we just have to wait and look at the polls to see, is this actually going to have some independents saying, I can put up with the tweets, I can put up with the porn stars, I can't put up with a criminally convicted president, because it is now, as Biden's campaign has pointed out, the only way to stop a criminal becoming president in November is to vote for Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think you're right. We just have to wait a few days because it's very easy to talk about the hypotheticals here. We just need to see. I reckon there's a very real chance that the polls won't change at all. Nothing has changed them all year. And maybe people are just that their feet are in concrete and they're just not moving to the other side, regardless of what happens.
Does it matter, though, that Donald Trump is, as well as being a criminal, he is, to the satisfaction of a jury, a liar? And the fact that throughout the course of this case, clearly the defence was hamstrung by the fact that Trump kept denying that he'd had an affair with Stormy Daniels. It was pretty obvious he'd had an affair with Stormy Daniels. He keeps saying he didn't do that. I mean, it does feel very 2016 to even be talking about any of this. Does any of that matter as we head towards this November's election?
I don't think so. I agree with you completely. He really hamstrung his own defence with his ridiculous denials. He made their job so much harder than it should have been. I actually think almost the most important person in this, because we know what Trump's going to do. Trump just does the same thing every time. The most important person I think feel this in terms of politics is Biden. How's Biden deal with this? Because if he spikes the football too much, I could see, because Trump's whole raison d'etre at the moment is political interference from Joe Biden. If Joe Biden leans into that, then that I wouldn't say this would hurt Joe Biden, but he might not get much bounce if people think looks like a setup from Joe Biden. Now, normally I wouldn't have thought there was any chance he'd do that, but a couple of days ago they had that insane press conference with Robert De Niro declaring Trump guilty, saying that there was going to be the end of this government in the world. It was just over the top and ridiculous. And if that is an indication of where they're going from here, then that is over the top. Whereas I think Biden doesn't need to say anything. He can play it really straight. The media will do the job for him. He just needs to shut up, I think.
Yeah, and we'll get a big clue on that when the debate comes along in under a month from now. Joe Biden, if he's wise, will probably say absolutely nothing. Yeah. People know who and what Donald Trump is now. They've made up their mind. It's kind of cooked in. Joe Biden just has to look like the imperfect but better alternative, the sensible, sane one compared to this guy. But let's get another perspective on all this from Republican analyst Sam Nunberg. He was an advisor to Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. And Sam is with us from West Palm Beach in the great state of Florida. Sam Nunberg, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Donald Trump is, as of today, a convicted criminal. Sam, how do you think he's feeling right now?
Well, I'm sure he'll put on a good face around his advisors, but later in the night, when he's alone or with a couple or with a couple of them, not the entire group, he will start to complain about the lawyers. And if I had to guess, one or two of these lawyers is going to be fired, probably, and off the other cases they're working on at the same time. He'll be working the phone to Fox News media personalities, and he'll be keeping his contacts up and talking to major donors and putting on a good face. But look, he hates losing. And regardless of whether or not he's actually surprised that he was found guilty today, I don't think anybody really could have been. He's not going to be happy.
So you think he would have expected this result?
Yes, I've spoken to people at the campaign who work with him, and he's pretty sober about the fact that he's entering New York City. It's very, very, first of all, in general, the government, the state or the federal government, or in this case, the city, they have a 96% conviction rate. It was always going to be whether or not he could actually get a mistrial, meaning one of the 12 jurors would say that he was not guilty, but nobody ever thought that he would be found not guilty. The fact of the matter is this case itself had a paper trail. Whether the case should have been brought, I don't believe it should have. I don't support the case being brought. I don't think that this was something that was worth the time and the money for the New York DA. This was something that was highly selective, and it shouldn't have been brought in the first place.
Sam, it's about 6 weeks now until Donald Trump is sentenced in New York. Back in 2020, 2021, 6 weeks was more than enough time for him to raise a mob to storm the Capitol to try and stop the certification of that election. Mm-hmm. Is there any prospect in your mind that we could see a protest, we could even see violence associated with that July 11th date?
Well, first of all, I do want to say he hasn't been charged criminally. I'm not going to defend his actions on January 6th, but I also don't want it to just be that he raised the mob and he coordinated the violence. That's just not true. I don't support what happened, and I hope that those people rot in jail. In terms of anything happening at the courtroom, no, nothing's going to happen. The reality of the situation is anybody that's thinking about doing anything, I think they've seen what happened to the January 6th violent protesters, the ones that were violent. They're sitting in jail and they're not getting out. And we haven't seen anything like that at the courthouses. I don't anticipate that. But Trump, if he doesn't want to get sentenced to jail in the interim, should not be saying anything which could be interpreted by his enemies as trying to have violence. But once again, that's easier said than done. To advise, you could advise until you're blue in the face not to do that. It doesn't mean that he won't. But no, I don't think so. And the other issue too is that I've been down there. It's not as open as the Capitol down there. It's very closed in type space. The NYPD, the New York Police Department, they have it completely under control. The FBI is right around there as well. So no, I don't anticipate anything like that.
What happens, Sam, if Trump loses the election and then wins the appeal? So that, like, how do conservatives react if they feel like Trump lost the election solely because of a charge that didn't stack up?
Well, I think that if Donald loses the election this time, I mean, I would hope he's done, and I can't imagine, especially because he would be, in his 80s, that he would be able to get the nomination at that point. You'd have a segment of the population that would be very upset about it, but I don't think that it'll necessarily cause the same type of uproar about election denialism, let's say, that we had with 2020. I think if Trump loses this time, he would be a power player within the Republican Party, but he wouldn't be able to control it.
So if you were a Democrat advisor, how would you advise Biden to deal with this moment?
Well, I'm not in the business of giving out advice to Democrats. I'm not in the business, but so I'll take a pass on that one.
Sure.
Respectfully.
Cool.
Sam, you were in the business of giving advice to Donald Trump. What advice would you be giving him right now?
I would continue to stay on the type of messaging that he is. I would be sure to say that there will be an appeal. He's calling it election interference, and to continue to talk about, as he's doing. Frankly, he's been on message when he's outside the courtroom. He's been doing a good job talking about, the economy, the border, what's going on in the world. And on those, he's winning. He's winning on all those issues. The only thing that Joe Biden has going for him in this election is he's running against Donald Trump. The only thing Donald Trump has going for him in this election is Joe Biden's record and Joe Biden's frailty. So that's what I would continue to say, and make it a choice. And to talk about the trajectory of what would happen to the country if Joe Biden were to win the election, and also put a focus. I think the campaign will, but start putting a focus on whether or not you want a President Kamala Harris in case Joe Biden doesn't survive a second term.
Well, Sam Nunberg, we always value your insights. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Our next guest this week, Nick Bryant, spent years as a BBC foreign correspondent with postings across the United States as well as South Asia and Australia, providing audiences in Britain and around the world with the insights of an outsider. More recently, though, he's combined his journalism with his first calling, that as an historian, to take a longer lens to his subjects, including the rise and fall of Australia and when America stopped being great. His new book is called The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself. Nick Bryant, welcome back to the Fireside Chat.
It's always fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. Big news today, obviously. I wonder, as both a journalist and a historian, is this bigger journalistically than historically? Does it matter in both columns?
It's a huge story and it is epic history. And I'm struck by that courthouse in Lower Manhattan is just a short walk, a 10-minute walk from where George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. So much epic history has unfolded in that little corner of Lower Manhattan. The Wall Street crash, Washington's inauguration, 9/11, of course, tragically. And now we have the first former president or sitting president in US history to become a convicted felon. But the key thing is, does that stop the 45th president from becoming the 47th president? And that's the interesting thing.
Does this go down as a good day because justice stood up even to the most powerful, or does it go down as a dark day?
Well, that exposes the absolute divide in America right now, doesn't it? This is such a polarising moment. It's not a moment when all of America comes together and thinks, yeah, justice has been done. We have watched a judicial process play out as it should. I mean, there is a totally different interpretation from Trump world, obviously, as he himself articulated after the verdict came through, seeing this as a political hatchet job from the Biden administration, seeing this as a rigged process, which he obviously described as an absolute disgrace. But of course, there were cheers outside the courtroom from Democrats, and outside of Trump Tower, straight away, somebody wrote in chalk on the sidewalk, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." 34 times. Such an emphatically American moment, this, but such an emphatically New York moment as well.
Of course, for generations, America was segregated along racial lines. Now it seems segregation exists as much on ideological lines. Yeah. And if you're in favour of Trump, then clearly you believe this is a witch hunt and that this is a political process orchestrated by Biden to stop Trump being re-elected because he was that good, they couldn't stand him to come back. And obviously half of America believes the reverse. Where does this leave us? And with those undecided voters, do you have any sense as to how they're going to process the fact that it is now going to be a criminal president if he's re-elected in November?
Well, a lot of polling, of course, shows that most people are completely unaffected by the verdict today and the trial and the whole process, just as a lot of people were unaffected by what happened on January the 6th and Trump's role in inciting a mob to actually storm the US Capitol to overturn a presidential election. But it's not the people that are unaffected that we need to focus on. It's not those people who are going to decide this election. They're rusted on already. They've decided whether they're going to vote for Biden or whether they're going to vote for Trump. It's that smaller cohort that often gets lost. They who are unsure about how this is going to impact them. And just a tiny fraction of them deciding, do you know what, I was going to vote for Trump, but now that he's a convicted felon, I won't. Just a tiny fraction in what is going to be a very close election will determine this. As we all know, it's pretty much 6 states that will decide this, and the margins are going to be wafer thin. So it's that cohort we should be focusing on.
As you say, most people expect almost all of America to not be affected by this in any way at all as far as the election. There's that small wafer you talk about that might be affected. Is there any historical parallel for a period where you can have this kind of momentous event that affects almost nobody?
That's a really great question. I mean, what I argue in the book is that we so often see Trump as this kind of historical outlier. A president like no other is a real cliche. Today I've heard another cliche being trotted out. This is uncharted territory. And in some ways, of course, it is. We've never seen a former president convicted before. But what I argue in the book is that American history is full of demagogues emerging, like Donald Trump. Some of the presidents that we regard as heroes of the American story have displayed surprisingly authoritarian tendencies, including Abraham Lincoln, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so often we see Trump as this radical departure in American history. What I argue in the book, The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself, is that he really is, in some ways, a continuum of American history. But it's just the American history that we've tended to ignore, forget, or deliberately erase.
Nick, it seems that one of the things that comes out in the book is that America has always had this idealised version of its past and its future, but its present is always going to hell in a handbasket. How does Trump fit into that? Because he is playing on nostalgia for the past and a better future, while also saying, look at everything that's going on around us. It's terrible.
Yeah, the grand narrative of American history really has been based on the idea of continual progress and advancement. American exceptionalism is based on that idea. And I think in many ways that's why Trump's victory in 2016 was so shocking, because it kind of contradicted our historical belief system. After America had elected an African-American president, that's progress. That's racial progress. Then surely we'd see progress on the gender side as well. So a black president would be followed by a female president. And what we got instead, of course, was a racist misogynist. And I think for many people that contradicted our idea of America's history and this idea of continual progress. But again, I argue that one of the reasons we kind of got Trump wrong in 2016 and why many people are still mystified by his continued popularity is because we've misunderstood the past. We have misunderstood American history.
Okay, let's take what you're saying that Trump belongs to a tradition in American history, but let's focus on for a second on the polarization and the hatred, the loathing. Are we at a point now in America where it's gotten to number 2 behind the Civil War, or are there many contenders where there was equal amounts of hatred?
Look, I think one of the key points to make, and I make it in the book, is division is America's default setting. victory over the British in the War of Independence brought about independence, but it did not necessarily mean that America would become a cohesive nation. In the early days, there was a fear, and Washington felt this very strongly, which is why he decided he would be president. He was reluctant to be president, was because he saw the United States of America actually splintering into 3 or 4 different confederations. The Constitution, in many ways, was an agreement to keep on disagreeing, which is why they came up with fudges, like the fudge on slavery, like the Electoral College. And of course, race was always a fault line that was going to erupt, and it erupted in the Civil War. You know, I think we probably are at a state that's the closest it's been to the 1860s, which was the decade in which the Civil War was. A lot of people say it was like the 1960s, but to be honest, there was a level of bipartisanship in the 1960s, a level of patriotic bipartisanship, partly because of the Cold War, that just isn't in existence today. And I do think there are similarities with the 1860s, although pessimistic though I am about American future, I don't think it is heading towards another civil war necessarily. But what I also say is I can't see America being in a state of civil peace.
Given that you raised it, is it even possible to have a civil war in the 21st century?
Well, not along the lines, I don't think, of what happened in the 1860s. I don't think we're going to be seeing a modern-day Gettysburg. You know, there isn't the geographic divide between North and South. There isn't the single-issue divide as there was on slavery. America is divided now, of course, on a whole swathe of issues. You know, we talk about the blue and the red states, but we often forget that within the blue states there are big blobs of blue, right? I mean, if you look at Texas, which is the deepest red state of all for many people, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio and Austin, they haven't got Republican mayors, right? They're Democratic strongholds. Of San Antonio's got an independent. So, you know, it's very different. I think also after January the 6th, the FBI really cracked down on the militia groups in the same way that they did after the Oklahoma bomb attack. You know, they've taken out the leadership of the militia groups in many ways. And I think a lot of these militia groups don't necessarily have the stomach for the fight. So I really do hope there won't be a civil war, but, you know, there will be flashpoints. And Trump's sentencing in July is a potential flashpoint and a potential worry.
Nick, you talk about Gettysburg. In the book, you write about Inauguration Day 2021, just 2 weeks after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and how, to test the teleprompter, the Gettysburg Address was loaded in, probably by some technician, maybe with a sense of history or maybe whatever they Googled. On that day, given how close America felt to an insurrection or a revolution, can you believe that we're back in a situation where that guy who refused, let's remember, to even stand on the podium to acknowledge that Biden was president, he hasn't conceded to this day, he continues that lie, that he is the front runner still, at least he was before this criminal conviction, that we are back here 4 years later?
John, that was an extraordinary day. I was stood on the inaugural platform. It was festooned with red, white and blue bunting, but really it should have been sealed off still with yellow police tape. It was a crime scene. That inaugural stage had been used as a staging post for an American insurrection led by an American president. That was so outrageous. The ringing line of Biden's inaugural address was "Democracy has prevailed," but he didn't say that out of a sense of celebration. He said it out of a sense of relief. I remember watching Marine One leave with Trump that day. It was heading to Andrews Air Force Base, to Air Force One to take him off to Florida. And just as he reached the Capitol Dome, it did a 180-degree turn and headed back towards the White House. And we thought, oh my God, has he forgotten something? Or does he not want to leave office? I mean, that was the kind of situation we're in that day. But about 6 weeks later, I was in Orlando, Florida at a CPAC conference. That's a conservative conference, as you know. And Trump made this triumphant return. I wouldn't describe it as his political resurrection, because by that time it was obvious that he hadn't suffered his political death. And rather than being a moment of Trumpian repudiation for the American conservative movement and the Republican Party, January the 6th became a moment of further radicalization. And in that moment, you realised this guy's going to be the nominee in 4 years' time.
Nick, you talk about how contemporary analysts said that Lincoln was in danger of becoming a dictator. Roosevelt was a dictator in the minds of many in the 1930s. We hear the same now about Donald Trump becoming a dictator, even if it's only for one day out of his mouth. Others saying he shows all these authoritarian tendencies. He could become a dictator. Given those guardrails you talk about in the Constitution, is there the potential for a re-elected Donald Trump to become a dictator, or is that in itself overblown?
I think one of the terrifying things that we found out after January the 6th is how much of the system is based on norms rather than laws. On January the 6th, if the Republicans had had a majority in the House of Representatives, which they didn't, Nancy Pelosi was the House Speaker, they could have actually said, you know what, we will overturn this election. So it wasn't a constitutional safeguard as much as a political one, the fact that the Democrats had control. And one of the reasons why the Constitution is sort of so vague on presidential powers is the fact that it was Washington who became the first president. They trusted Washington. They regarded Washington as his own check and balance. The man that surrendered his sword at the end of the War of Independence, they thought would not usurp too much power as president. And he did that. He was very aware of the example he was setting. But the kind of looseness around defining presidential power has been exploited over the years, like Lincoln, like FDR. And the kind of interesting thing is, American voters have often liked that. They like an American strongman. Eleanor Roosevelt said that the biggest applause line that her husband got in 1933 was not when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself in his inaugural address. It was when he said, you realise, I might have to test the bounds of the Constitution here. I might have to adopt wartime powers in peace. Now, that went down very well. American people have supported strongman presidents, and they tend to punish the weak and the frail. And that is a worry for Joe Biden.
So do you think then that it might not be that Donald Trump himself is particularly authoritarian? It might be that the people are demanding authoritarians.
Well, I do fear that he will be authoritarian because he showed such tendencies in his first administration. I mean, in his inauguration, he said, let's do something like North Korea. Let's do the tanks and the choppers rather than the high school bands, which is the traditional inaugural parade. I mean, he's talked about suspending the Constitution. He's talked about exterminating journalists. I mean, he was surrounded by grown-ups, thankfully, who were in the room. But in the second Trump administration, are those grown-ups still going to be around? No, they're not. He's made that very clear right now. He's spoken about being a dictator on day one, but goodness me, my fear is his second term could be defined by him trying to exercise those kind of dictatorial powers. And I'm frightened by the prospect of a second term of a Trump administration, yeah.
Well, Nick Bryant, congratulations on another terrific and readable book. We're very glad today of all days to have you come by for a fireside chat, so thank you once again.
Well, thank you both. Look, you've got this wonderful Oval Office set. There is one thing that's missing. I mean, very strangely, the last book that I wrote, When America Stopped Being Great, did end up in the Oval Office. In fact, it's still in Joe Biden's Oval Office today, in the desk right behind him. So to complete your set, there's a copy of When America Stopped Being Great.
Thanks very much.
And Chaz, there's a copy of The Forever War as well.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It's always
Nick
great
Bryant.
to talk to you.
Thank you, Nick Bryant. And that is it for another Fireside Chat. If you can join us for Planet America next Wednesday night, you'll be greeted by a very special guest co-host, one Julia Baird.
And because we're sick of John, next Friday we're going to have David Lipson on as well. And don't forget, there is a brand new pet podcast that you can find today in all the usual pod places. We might discuss a little trial.
See you soon.